What happens when a royal guest completely loses control on live television and turns a simple interview into a public relations nightmare? Well, buckle up, because what unfolded between Prince Harry and Savannah Guthrie on the Today Show was nothing short of explosive. We're talking about a meltdown so spectacular that it ended with security being called and a guest being physically escorted from the studio. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really triggered Harry's outburst. The morning started like any other at the Today Show studios in New York. Savannah Guthrie had arrived early, as she always did, reviewing her notes for what was supposed to be a straightforward promotional interview. Prince Harry was scheduled to discuss his latest charitable endeavors and upcoming projects. The kind of feel-good segment that typically filled the show's lighter moments. The production team had been briefed that this would be a friendly conversation. Nothing controversial, just a chance for Harry to connect with American audiences about his work. Behind the scenes, however, there were already warning signs that something was off. Harry had arrived at the studio nearly 30 minutes late, which immediately put the production schedule behind. When he finally walked through the doors, staff members noticed his demeanor was unusually tense. Gone was the characteristic charm and easy smile that had made him a media favorite for years. Instead, he seemed agitated, constantly checking his phone and barely acknowledging the crew members who greeted him. The makeup artist later told colleagues that Harry had been difficult to work with, fidgeting constantly and making sharp comments about the lighting and camera angles. He complained that the chair wasn't positioned correctly, that the background looked cheap, and that the entire setup was beneath his standards. When a junior producer politely suggested some minor adjustments to make him more comfortable, Harry snapped back with a comment about how American television clearly didn't understand proper protocol. Savannah, meanwhile, was completely unaware of the brewing storm. She had always maintained professional relationships with her guests regardless of their status or background, and she approached this interview with her usual thorough preparation. She had researched Harry's recent activities, prepared thoughtful questions about his charitable work, and even included some lighter topics about his life in California that she thought would resonate with viewers. As the cameras prepared to roll, the tension in the studio was palpable to anyone paying attention. Harry sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched, and his hands gripping the armrests. The usual pre-in banter that helps guests relax was met with one-word responses. When Savannah tried to make a joke about the early morning start time, Harry's forced smile lasted barely a second before his expression returned to stone-cold seriousness. The interview began smoothly enough with Savannah's warm introduction, and Harry managing to pull together some semblance of his public persona. But those who knew him well would have noticed the subtle signs of irritation. The way his voice carried a slight edge even when discussing topics he was supposedly passionate about. His answers were shorter than usual, lacking the enthusiasm and personal anecdotes that typically made his interviews engaging. When Savannah asked about his adjustment to American life, something that should have been an easy positive question, Harry's response was surprisingly defensive. He spoke about the challenges of being constantly scrutinized, about how difficult it was to build a new life when people were always watching and judging. There was an underlying bitterness in his tone that caught Savannah off guard, though she maintained her professional composure. The first real crack in Harry's facade appeared when Savannah brought up his family's support for his new ventures. It was meant to be a softball question, an opportunity for him to speak positively about his relationships and show his human side. Instead, Harry's entire body language shifted. His shoulders tensed, his eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment he seemed to be calculating his response rather than speaking from the heart. His answer was carefully measured, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of resentment. He spoke about having to forge his own path, about not being able to rely on others for support, about the loneliness of making difficult decisions without guidance. While he never directly criticized anyone, the implication was clear to anyone listening closely. Savannah sensed the shift in energy, but pressed forward, hoping to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Harry seemed determined to use this platform for something other than the light promotional piece everyone had expected. When Savannah asked about his future plans, he launched into what could only be described as a barely veiled attack on those who had questioned his choices. He talked about people who claimed to care about him while undermining his efforts, about the hypocrisy of those who preached family values while abandoning family members, about the courage it took to stand up for what was right, even when it meant standing alone. The studio crew exchanged worried glances as they realized this interview was spiraling away from anything resembling the agreed-upon topics. Savannah, to her credit, tried multiple times to redirect the conversation toward more positive subjects. But Harry seemed intent on using every question as an opportunity to air his grievances. His voice grew more passionate, his gestures more animated, and his comments more pointed with each passing minute. When they cut to commercial break, Savannah leaned over to ask if everything was all right, if there was anything Harry needed to discuss off camera before they continued. But instead of appreciating her concern, Harry seemed to interpret her question as condescension. His response was sharp and dismissive, suggesting that perhaps American journalists weren't equipped to handle serious conversations about real issues. The comment stung, not just because of its obvious rudeness, but because it revealed a level of arrogance and entitlement that completely contradicted the humble, service-oriented image Harry had cultivated. Savannah maintained her professionalism, but those watching closely could see her jaw tighten slightly as she processed what had just been said to her in her own studio. As they prepared to return from commercial, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a routine celebrity interview was now feeling more like a confrontation waiting to happen. Harry sat back in his chair with an expression that seemed almost challenging, as if he was daring Savannah to push back against his increasingly hostile behavior. The crew members could sense that something significant was about to unfold, though none of them could have predicted just how ugly things were about to get. When they returned from commercial break, Savannah made one final attempt to salvage the interview by steering toward what she hoped would be neutral territory. She asked Harry about his charitable foundation's recent achievements, a topic that should have allowed him to showcase his work in a positive light. But even this softball question seemed to trigger something deeper in Harry's psyche. "You know, Savannah," Harry began, his voice carrying a condescending tone that immediately set alarm bells ringing. "I find it interesting how American media always wants to focus on the feel-good stories while completely ignoring the systemic issues that make charity necessary in the first place. It's almost like you're more comfortable with surface-level conversations than addressing real problems." Savannah blinked, taken aback by the unprovoked attack, disguised as an answer. She had conducted thousands of interviews over her career and was no stranger to difficult guests. But Harry's comment was so unnecessarily hostile that it caught her completely off guard. Still, she maintained her composure and tried to redirect. "Well, we certainly do cover serious issues here at Today," she replied diplomatically. "But I thought today we were focusing on the positive impact of your work and how viewers might get involved in supporting these causes." Harry let out a laugh that was anything but amused. "There it is again. You want to keep things positive, keep things light. God forbid we have an actual substantive conversation about why these problems exist in the first place. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I discuss the media's refusal to engage with difficult truths." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Savannah felt her professional patience being tested in a way rarely had been before. She had built her career on asking tough questions and tackling serious subjects. And to be lectured about journalistic integrity by someone who had never worked a day in media felt like a slap in the face. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Harry," she said, her voice remaining steady but with a subtle edge that viewers were beginning to notice. "We've covered plenty of challenging topics on this show, and I've always believed in asking the questions that need to be asked. Have you, though?" Harry shot back, his eyes narrowing. "Because from where I sit, it seems like American television is more interested in entertainment than enlightenment. You want the celebrity, you want the royal connection, but you don't want to deal with the uncomfortable realities that come with it." The studio fell silent except for the hum of equipment. Even the camera operators, who had seen their share of tense moments, were beginning to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't just a difficult interview anymore. It was becoming a public humiliation of their host broadcast live to millions of viewers. Savannah took a deep breath, drawing on every bit of her professional training. "I think you might be mischaracterizing both this show and this conversation, Harry. We invited you here to discuss your work and your perspectives. If you have specific issues you'd like to address, I'm certainly willing to explore them." "Oh, how generous of you," Harry replied with unmistakable sarcasm. "You're willing to explore them as if you're doing me some kind of favor by allowing me to speak about subjects that matter. This is exactly the kind of patronizing attitude I've come to expect from people who think they are in positions of authority." The comment was so far over the line that even the most diplomatic response seemed impossible. Savannah felt her cheeks flush slightly, not from embarrassment, but from genuine anger at being treated with such disrespect in her own studio. She had remained professional through countless challenging interviews, but Harry was testing limits she didn't even know she had. "I'm not quite sure what's happening here," she said, her voice still controlled, but with steel underneath. "But I think we might want to take a step back and remember that we're having a conversation, not a confrontation." Harry leaned forward in his chair, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Are we having a conversation, Savannah? Because it feels more like you're trying to manage me, trying to keep me in my lane, like some kind of trained performer here for your audience's entertainment." "That's absolutely not what's happening," Savannah replied firmly. "I've treated you with nothing but respect since you walked into this studio." "Respect?" Harry's voice rose slightly, causing the audio technicians to adjust their levels. "Is that what you call it when you try to reduce everything I care about to feel good television segments? When you dismiss serious issues as too heavy for your morning show audience?" Savannah could feel her patience finally beginning to crack. "Harry, I haven't dismissed anything. I've asked you thoughtful questions about your work, and instead of answering them, you've chosen to attack me and this show. I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish here today, but this isn't it." "There it is," Harry said with a triumphant expression that was deeply unsettling. "The real Savannah Guthrie. Scratch the surface just a little bit, and the professional facade crumbles. You can't handle being challenged, can you? You're used to guests who play along with your little format, who give you the sound bites you want for your highlight reels." The accusation was so unfair and so clearly designed to provoke a reaction that Savannah found herself fighting to maintain the composure that had served her throughout her career. She had conducted interviews with world leaders, covered major breaking news stories, and faced down politicians trying to dodge difficult questions. But something about Harry's entitled arrogance was pushing buttons she didn't even know existed. "I think you're projecting quite a bit here," she said, her voice carrying a warning that anyone paying attention would have recognized. "I've been nothing but professional with you, and I don't appreciate being lectured about journalism by someone who's never actually practiced it." Harry's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Oh, so now we're talking about qualifications. That's rich coming from someone who probably got her job based more on her ability to smile at a camera than her journalistic credentials." The comment landed like a physical blow. It was sexist, dismissive, and designed to undermine everything Savannah had worked for throughout her career. The silence in the studio was deafening as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Harry had crossed a line so clearly and so deliberately that there was no pretending this was anything other than a personal attack. Savannah's composure finally cracked, not into anger, but into something much more powerful, a cold fury that made her voice deadly quiet. "Excuse me. You heard me perfectly well," Harry continued, seemingly oblivious to the dangerous territory he had entered. "This entire industry is built on pretty faces and manufactured personalities. Real substance, real courage to ask difficult questions, that's much rarer than you'd like to admit." "I think," Savannah said, her voice carrying a level of authority that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. "You need to be very careful about what you say next." But Harry, either too arrogant or too caught up in his own sense of righteousness to recognize the warning, pressed forward with what would prove to be his final mistake. "Careful? Why should I be careful? Because I might upset the delicate sensibilities of morning television. Because I might say something that doesn't fit into your comfortable little world where everyone pretends difficult truths don't exist." The transformation in Savannah was visible to everyone watching. The warm, accommodating host who had tried so hard to make this interview work disappeared, replaced by a journalist who had dealt with far tougher adversaries than an entitled prince having a public meltdown. "Let me tell you something, Harry," Savannah began, her voice cutting through the studio air like a blade. "I've covered wars, natural disasters, presidential elections, and Supreme Court decisions. I've interviewed heads of state, Nobel Prize winners, and yes, members of your own family who managed to conduct themselves with dignity and respect. So when you sit in that chair and suggest that I got my job because of my appearance rather than 2 decades of hard work and journalistic excellence, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every woman who has had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously in this industry." Harry's face went pale as he realized that his attack had not only failed to intimidate Savannah, but had awakened something far more formidable than he had bargained for. The woman sitting across from him was no longer the accommodating host trying to manage a difficult guest. She was a seasoned journalist who had dealt with world leaders and wasn't about to be bullied by someone throwing a tantrum on live television. "Now wait just a minute," Harry began. But Savannah held up her hand with such authority that he actually stopped talking. "No, you wait a minute," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "You came into my studio, you were treated with courtesy and respect, and you've spent the last 20 minutes attacking me, attacking this show, and attacking American journalism in general. And for what? Because I asked you about your charity work. Because I tried to give you a platform to discuss the causes you claim to care about. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most explosive live television moments in recent memory. Harry sat frozen in his chair, apparently unable to process that someone was finally calling him out on his behavior with the same energy he had been dishing out. You want to talk about substance. You want to talk about difficult truths. Savannah pressed on, her years of experience as a prosecutor before her journalism career evident in the way she systematically dismantled his position. Then let's talk about the truth of what just happened here. You showed up late. You were rude to my staff. You turned every question into an opportunity to air your personal grievances. And when I tried to maintain some semblance of professionalism, you decided to attack my qualifications and suggest that I'm just a pretty face reading a teleprompter. Harry finally found his voice, but his response revealed just how far out of his depth he truly was. You're putting words in my mouth. I never said, oh, but you did say it. Savannah interrupted, her tone becoming even more pointed. And you said it on live television to millions of viewers. You said it because you thought you could come in here and steamroll an American journalist the way you've apparently been allowed to steamroll people in other situations. Well, this isn't one of those situations, and I'm not one of those people. The production team watched in fascination as Harry began to realize that his usual tactics weren't working. His entitled behavior, which had probably been enabled by people afraid to challenge someone with his status, was meeting its match in a woman who had built her career on holding powerful people accountable. I think you're overreacting, Harry said weakly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. I was just trying to have a meaningful conversation about serious issues. Savannah let out a laugh that was both incredulous and cutting. Meaningful conversation. Is that what you call telling me that American television doesn't understand serious issues? That I'm more interested in entertainment than enlightenment? That I probably got my job based on my looks rather than my abilities? If that's your idea of meaningful conversation, then I'd hate to see what you consider an insult. The studio crew had never seen anything quite like this. Guests occasionally became difficult, but they had never witnessed someone so thoroughly and publicly dismantled on live television. Harry looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue him from the situation he had created. But everyone's attention was focused on Savannah as she continued her methodical destruction of his credibility. You know what the real irony is here, Harry, she continued, leaning forward in her chair. You came on this show supposedly to talk about your charitable work, your commitment to making the world a better place, your dedication to service. But what you've actually demonstrated is an incredible level of self-absorption, disrespect for others, and a complete inability to engage in civil discourse when someone doesn't immediately defer to your every opinion. Harry's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had clearly expected to be able to control this narrative, to use his status and charm to deflect any pushback. Instead, he found himself facing a journalist who was not only unimpressed by his title, but was actively holding him accountable for his behavior in real time. I don't think I have to sit here and be attacked, he said, starting to stand up from his chair. Sit down, Savannah commanded with such authority that Harry actually complied before he realized what he was doing. You started this conversation by attacking me and this show. You don't get to play the victim now that someone is finally responding to your behavior with the same energy you brought to this studio. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that even Harry seemed stunned by the transformation. The entitled prince, who had walked into the studio expecting differential treatment, was now being dressed down by a journalist who had clearly had enough of his nonsense. Furthermore, Savannah continued, if you think this represents how Americans respond to being bullied, you've seriously misjudged the situation. We don't bow and scrape to people just because they have titles. We judge people by their actions, their character, and their ability to treat others with respect. And by those standards, your performance here today has been absolutely disgraceful. Harry made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. I think perhaps we should end this interview now. This clearly isn't going the way either of us intended. Oh no, Savannah replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You wanted a meaningful conversation about difficult truths. Remember, you wanted substance instead of surface-level pleasantries. Well, here's a difficult truth for you. Your behavior today has been that of a spoiled, entitled brat who thinks his title gives him the right to treat people however he pleases. And here's another truth. That kind of behavior might be tolerated wherever you come from, but it's not acceptable here. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry sat in his chair, looking like he had been physically struck, while Savannah maintained her composure with the satisfaction of someone who had finally said what needed to be said. The camera operators continued filming, knowing they were capturing television history. Finally, Harry stood up again, this time with more determination. "I don't have to listen to this," he said, removing his microphone. "You're absolutely right," Savannah agreed. "You don't have to listen to it, but you did have to hear it, and so did everyone watching. Security will escort you out." As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared at the edge of the set. Harry looked around the studio one more time, perhaps hoping someone would intervene on his behalf, but found only the faces of crew members who had witnessed his behavior firsthand. His exit was swift and without dignity, leaving Savannah alone at the interview desk. She turned to face the camera directly, her composure completely restored. "Well, folks, that's certainly not how we planned to spend this segment of the show. But sometimes journalism means holding people accountable for their words and actions regardless of their status or position. We'll be right back after this break with the weather forecast." What happened in that studio became the most talked about television moment of the year. A perfect example of what occurs when entitled behavior meets professional accountability. Make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories like this one, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Savannah went too far, or did Harry get exactly what he deserved?